Okay.
Good afternoon or good evening, wherever you may be listening to us from on this big, beautiful planet of ours. This is Michael Cross here with another edition of Unlock the Door Radio here on UCY TV Productions, where we dig a little deeper than that mainstream media out there. Well, that's not that difficult, is it? Because the mainstream media really doesn't seem to want to tackle big issues anymore. Now, one of those big issues, something that really concerns me, and I don't see a lot of reports about it in the mainstream media, is human trafficking. Now, that's the topic of my latest book, Freedom from Conscience, Descent into Darkness, in which I deal with like government corruption and human trafficking within the plot. And while it's fiction, it's based on fact. Now, tonight we have a special guest from the Set Me Free Project, and that's based in Omaha, Nebraska. Stephanie, hello.
Hello, how are you?
I'm doing great now that we got the Skype working perfectly now.
Yay.
Hey,
thank you for having me.
I'm glad you came on, because you know what? When I first saw, this thing with human trafficking, you usually think of cities like Moscow and Istanbul and Berlin and London and New York. You don't think of Omaha, Nebraska. So what got you involved in this? And we're going to go into a lot more detail about what's going on in America.
Yeah, well, unfortunately, a lot is going on in America, and Omaha, Nebraska is not exempt from a lot of the horrific things that are happening. But human trafficking, sex trafficking, and there's many forms of human trafficking. I focus primarily on sex trafficking, which looks like prostitution, pornography, things like that. And it is alive and well in the Midwest, and Nebraska in particular. Omaha is a hotspot for trafficking.
Well, now that's interesting because, I had a student that got really involved in this. She set up her own website stuff, got a phone call from a U.S. senator that was really involved in fighting human trafficking. He died in a plane crash later on, but it listed as an accident. Who knows? But the thing is that this is about 15, 16 years ago. And there was some media coverage about like Eastern European women being trafficked and sold around the world. A girl gets she answers an ad for an au pair or nanny, and she's got these dreams of coming to America, for instance. And then when she gets here, she winds up, passport taken, stuck in a brothel, and she's a slave. Is this the way it works?
Well, sometimes it works that way. I always had the image of trafficking from the movie Taken, where you had the, young teenage girl going off to Europe with her friend and then winding up getting abducted and all of that craziness that comes after that. But the reality of what's happening in America is a little bit different. We're not so much seeing the abductions although there are the false ads and things like that. What we're seeing more is a grooming process with our young kids, where youth are a lot of times on social media, on online gaming, and these traffickers are building relationships with our kids, and then they're putting them in situations that they would have never been normally going into on their own. And so it is a grooming process. It's relationship building. Most victims of trafficking know they're traffickers before they're victimized.
Oh, it brings to mind there was a case in London or somewhere in England where young girls were being groomed. I think it was by a gang from, like, they were Pakistani or something like this, British girls. And it was a process by which they were kind of initiated in, and then all of a sudden they wound up being used. That's Absolutely. What you're talking about.
Yep. That's what we see a lot. And the majority of trafficked victims, because of this grooming process, and trafficking is defined as force, fraud, or coercion of a human being. And when we're looking at that type of force, fraud, or coercion, the mental chains on these people, that grooming process, the majority of victims do not even self-identify as victims of human trafficking, because they see it as a relationship that they're in. They are participating in something between maybe a boyfriend, girlfriend, or whatever, where they're helping out in this relationship, and they see themselves as essentially choosing this lifestyle.
Okay, so let me see here. You know, a lot of parents have no idea all the social media. I mean, they know Facebook and stuff like that, but they're not aware of things like Instagram, Tumblr, and so forth,
Right.
where a lot of young girls, like 12, 13, 14, will make these posts about how depressed and lonely they are, and they'll put pictures up like gothic images and so forth. And then, you know, anyone can hit follow, or anyone can ask to be a friend in these social networks, and then eventually build up some sort of relationship, and eventually admit to, well, I'm not actually 14 like you are, but I'm older, but I'm still concerned. You've seen that?
Yeah, absolutely. Set Me Free Project is really geared to preventing kids from ever seeing the dark of trafficking. So we're focused on youth and families, and our streamlined focus is prevention and education, because about 1 to 2% of victims globally are rescued. So if we're looking at only 1 to 2% of trafficking victims ever being rescued, let's stop trafficking before it starts. And what we find is, because of the increase of social media and the things that are happening, kids are global. I mean, and they are posting things about themselves that you would never say to a total stranger. And because a lot of their self-esteem and self-worth comes from, how many likes do I have on social media? How many followers do I have on social media? They are allowing people to follow them that they would never necessarily talk to in real life. And these traffickers have a global network, and it's a big business where they can find out as much as they can about these kids, and then send in a recruiter who can really draw them into a relationship. It's remarkably terrifying what happens.
So it's a lot more advanced than, like, let's say when I was in high school, you know, when they had discotheques still. That might date me a little bit. But I remember they were warning people. I lived in Oregon, and they were warning young girls to be careful of these agents that were they were agents of, like, live sex shows in Japan. And they would come over and they'd talk to these young girls at discotheques and say, hey, you're beautiful and everything. Would you like to come to Japan and be a model?
Yep.
And then get them there. But this is way more advanced, this social media thing, because you know everything about the person in the first place.
Exactly. That's exactly right. And I always say I am so grateful social media did not exist when I was young, because it's nightmarish, really. And the things that people can find out about you, the things that the kids are posting on social media is terrifying. And they don't even realize that I did a little experiment on a gal that I am friends with on Facebook, which is considered the innocent social media. And I found out every piece of information I would possibly need as a cute young guy who wanted to recruit this gal into trafficking and build a relationship. And it does not take much for information to be passed on the internet and through social media.
So let me see how this might work. Because I think sometimes people get a disconnect. they think of trafficking involving women living in third world countries or Russian girls tricked or something like that. But it sounds like that the trafficker would actually aim more towards the kind of the middle class type of girl, wouldn't they? You know, kind of the that would be the cream of the crop. That if they got
Sure.
them, then
Absolutely.
do they cost more? I mean, if they get the kind of the girl next door versus the runaway that's shooting drugs or something.
Well, the average age of entry into prostitution for girls is 12 to 14. For boys, it's 11. And the trend is the younger that you have, the higher the price point, essentially. And so you are going to get more money with a girl that's younger. You're going to get, boys are even more profitable than girls are. And so that's kind of the trend. Now, traffickers go after the vulnerable, and that can be a very high percentage of traffic victims have been through the foster care system at some point. Runaways are remarkably vulnerable. There's a statistic that says 1 in 3 runaways within 48 hours will be approached by a trafficker. So within 48 hours of your child running away, they are going to be targeted by a trafficker. And so they definitely go after the vulnerable, and whether that vulnerable child is vulnerable because of sexual abuse or because of drugs or because of a bad family life, they're going to be targeted. But what people need to understand is exactly what you said. Your child could be vulnerable because they post, yeah, my parents are being jerks today, and they post something on social media, and that trafficker swoops in and has compassion and relates to what they're saying, and they're building a relationship, and boom, that child is vulnerable. So I think if I could get one message to parents out there, or just the community as a whole, globally, it would be your child is at risk. And it doesn't matter where you live, doesn't matter who you are, doesn't matter, your child is at risk.
Yeah, I mean, the interesting thing is I know someone who she was living in Lebanon, going to university there. I mean, that's kind of an interesting destination, you know, Lebanon.
Yeah.
And I'm not talking about Lebanon, Oregon. I'm talking about Lebanon, Beirut. And it's peaceful now. But the thing is that she was going to go on a tour with a couple of friends throughout the Middle East. And her father insisted, and he said, you know, every time when you get off the airplane, first thing you do is you contact the embassy and let them know where you're at.
Yes.
Because, you know, if you get abducted, there's no way to find you.
Right.
And then we have the situation where we have, but you know, within the America, I've heard some pretty big horror stories about young girls. They go to Hollywood. They've been doing this since the 1920s. They go to Hollywood, and they get into this as well, and wind up getting, like, you know, sold off to like really rich, well-connected type people.
Mm-hmm. And that's the thing that's important to remember. I think sometimes when we think of a prostitute, our perception needs to change on what a prostitute is, what a pimp is, and what a buyer is, or as we've referred to them as Johns. And if we think of the prostitute on the streets who is there because she is doing drugs and she's choosing this lifestyle, and we think of the pimp as this really cool guy who's got all of this money and gold teeth and chains, and then we think of the buyer as somebody who's some scumbag on the street who is just needing, you know, sex for $15, we really need to change our perception. That happens out there, but the reality is that a pimp is a scumbag trafficker, and a prostitute is a victim, and the buyers let's face it, they usually have money. And so a lot of times when we're thinking about the power players in our society, the people who could actually stop this from happening, a lot of times they're complicit. And so, you were talking about somebody accidentally dying. That happens because this is a very big business. Sex trafficking and labor trafficking alone is a $150 billion industry. Those two alone, $150 billion. And so when we're talking about that kind of money, we're talking about power players that do not want this to end. And so they're going to do whatever it takes to make sure that this is still something that can continue and be profitable and work for them.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of times people don't realize this has been going on like in American history for a long time. In Portland, Oregon, I put that in my book, that's where it's centered. But in Portland, Oregon, they used to do this thing where, you'd get like a sailor, you'd get him drunk, and it was just like those Sweeney Todd, that Sweeney Todd movie where suddenly the chair goes out and they fall down into this underground place, and then the chair goes back up. They really had this, and then the guy wakes up and he's on a boat heading to, and that's why they call it Shanghai, because he's on a boat, they're already gone, and he's going to be on that boat, or else he can swim back home. But they did that with young girls too, that they would capture them, and they'd either wind up in a brothel somewhere or even sold internationally, because there's slave trade. It was really big, what they call white slavery was big in those days.
Yep.
In Greece, they still Turkey still raided Greece for sex slaves up until the end of the First World War. I mean, this is part of history.
This is not a new problem. That is for sure. And it's been going on for a long, long time. And it is something that will continue until people stand up and say, you know what, this is just an unacceptable thing in our society. And in order to do that, it really takes a lot of awareness and understanding what it is, because let's face it, I think the majority of us would love to just hide our head in the sand and pretend none of this exists, because it's very evil, and it's hard to imagine that young children, as infants, are trafficked. I mean, when we think of the sick, twisted thing that is happening with human beings, it's really something that it's hard to look at.
Yeah, and I can imagine with this whole refugee crisis as it exists in the Middle East. You hear about the Yazidi women being sold at 8 years old, being sold as sex slaves by ISIS. But that's not, that you hear about ISIS, but you don't, these are people that they're displaced. And the same true for, women coming across the border, the Mexican border into the United States. They're vulnerable. No one knows they're there. There must be some horror stories that no one will ever know about.
Exactly. And I think that when we talk about certain groups of people, like ISIS or like refugees or whatever it may be, it's really easy to create almost a caricature of these people, as if they do not exist as true human beings, because it's not right in front of our face. And so when we understand that, and this is really the main message that we deal with, you are valuable, and so is everybody else. And these are human beings that we're dealing with. And, you mentioned the political structure. We do a lot with cyberbullying, and it goes back to that value piece. But we as a human being, we have this ability to subhumanize people, or to turn them into, you look at the political candidates, it's really easy to turn them into almost, and I don't mean this even with disrespect, but almost as cartoon characters. They're not real people to us, so it's very easy to take them and bash them or to say horrible things about them without even thinking, oh my goodness, that is a person with a family and with a life and whatever it may be. But we have created this ability to do this with slavery, with bullying, with whatever it is. We have this ability to take a person and dehumanize them, because you can't sell somebody if you recognize that they are a valuable human being.
How long does someone that gets trafficked, then I'm going to get into some more statistics and into pornography and those kinds of things, but what's the lifespan of someone who gets, into the general trafficking in, for instance, the United States? I mean, I'm sure the lifespan of someone in the Middle East in ISIS territory is going to be pretty short, but
yeah,
in America.
Yeah. Yep, I've heard a stat just recently that the lifespan of a trafficked victim is no more than 7 years. And so it's a very, very short lifespan. There's a number of different reasons for that, aside from the fact that it's a horrific life. But there's drugs involved. There's strong and heavy abuse involved. A lot of times they're murdered, whether it be by their trafficker or by a buyer. It's a very short lifespan.
Mm-hmm. Now, statistically, how many, you mentioned a little bit about this, but worldwide, how many people are trafficked? And in America, at any given time, what's your estimate?
Well, worldwide, about 32 billion people are...
Million.
I'm sorry, 32 million. Yes, thank you. But in the U.S., they've identified about 6,000 sex trafficking cases where those have been reported, and those are people who have been identified as sex trafficked victims. So if we know that only 1 to 2% of trafficked victims are rescued, and there are about 6,000 that have been reported, that shows about 600,000 people that are identified essentially as trafficked victims. And so the numbers are really tough. Data in this area is very difficult because a lot of data is taken off of rescued victims, which is very low. So it's a very tough thing to find data for, but it's a much bigger number than is being reported.
Mm-hmm. Now, without naming names, have you ever encountered a victim personally or through your network that was a victim of people that were the established, whether it be by finances or by politics? And again, you don't need to name names, but have you had that happen where you suddenly will hear these stories about you and you go, wow, you mean he or she is involved in this kind of thing?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Actually, just recently in Lincoln, Nebraska, there was a bust with people who were buying, and these weren't the traffickers, but these were people buying prostitutes, that one of them was a well-known judge, one of them was a well-known and successful high school teacher and coach. It happens all the time. As far as people who have been victimized by traffickers or big business, yes. Omaha, unfortunately, has a very sordid history when it comes to trafficking. And in Omaha, there was a huge scandal that happened in the 1980s called the Franklin Scandal. You can Google that. That went literally all the way up to the White House. But the people who were involved were very, very important, wealthy people in Omaha, including the chief of police. So a lot of stuff there, and I have spoken to victims personally who were trafficked or sold to the community leaders. It's very common.
And if that's like you're talking about like a judge or a high school teacher or something like that, the traffickers must have clients that are, you know, part of the 0.1% people too, you know, that have their, you know, their private villa, you know, way out in the middle of nowhere or something.
Oh yeah. Yep. And that is part of the problem with stopping trafficking is there's a ton of money and power involved. And when there is that much money and power complicit in the crime, it's very easy to shut down anybody who might try and stop it.
Okay. Now, what is the connection with pornography? I mean, of course, pornography is like this like pyramid or something like that. You've got maybe the very top, you wind up with the college girl who decides, you know what, I can make a lot more money doing this than I can going out and doing whatever to pay for student loans or whatever. But then at the base, you've got all of the really not kind of the dark web stuff, you might say. How does the trafficking, are like the people that are trafficked, they wind up there, or how's that work?
Yeah, well, pornography, also big business, is very, very heavily linked with trafficking. Not only do traffickers use pornography to desensitize and groom their victims, but they also use pornography to desensitize and groom their buyers. And so pornography is, in a lot of areas, complicit with trafficking. We have, there's a statistic, and statistics tend to disappear on the internet. It's kind of interesting when it comes to this subject. But there was a statistic, so I cannot reference this for you, that said that approximately 80% of online pornography used traffic victims. And whether that is an accurate number or not, we do know that a lot of online pornography involves a trafficking situation. And so essentially what you're seeing is somebody getting raped on camera. And that's a very, I think, stark thing to say. But pornography is one of those things that uses men and women to bring in money. It's still the selling of a human being. Now, I would love somebody to do a study on people who say, you know, we've seen porn stars interviewed saying, this is the lifestyle I chose and it's been wonderful for me. And we've seen people who have been interviewed saying, yes, I'm a madam. I only have high-end clientele. I only have high-end girls and they choose this. And I would love somebody to do a study on all of these people, whether it be strippers or prostitutes that say they've chosen it, madams, pornography stars, saying they've chosen this lifestyle. I would love them to go back and see where the victimization began, because I guarantee you that there is some form of victimization in their life that led them to whatever it is that they're doing. I have a hard time believing that legit porn is something that is a chosen lifestyle.
Yeah, and even if it were, you know, we've been talking a lot about, you know, how capitalism and money are involved in a lot of this stuff. And to me, just personally, it just seems like pornography, moral issues aside, you know, that sort of thing.
Yep.
That pornography is sort of the apex or the ultimate expression of like capitalism divorced of any morality, because you're taking something that, like, probably the most intimate thing a person can do, and you're making it into a commodity. You're making it into a form of spectator sport. And,
Absolutely.
And in that sense, that's where I would, if you've got kids, you tell, you can say, well, you shouldn't look at that because it's bad or something like that. But maybe that would make them think a little differently.
Well, and I think what it does is it goes back to the dehumanization of a human being. If you're watching two people going at it on camera, you don't look at that. That's somebody's daughter. That's somebody's mom. That's whatever. You don't look at them as human beings. And so you can look at that and then move to the prostitute and say, well, this is not a human being. This is somebody. And that's how it happens. That's how we become so desensitized to the buying and selling of human beings.
Well, and that is partially institutionalized. I mean, I have a friend that teaches criminology, and she notes that if, like, you look at media attention or anything like that, if a girl is like a stripper and she disappears, I mean, she's abducted, versus a woman, in a nice middle-class neighborhood, she gets abducted the same exact way, walking to her car, gets grabbed. The media will pay way more attention, and I think the police do as well, to the gal in the middle-class neighborhood, because the stripper, there's kind of this moral thing like, well, she was sort of asking for it in people's minds.
Absolutely. Yeah, you're absolutely right. And that's what's so tragic about what's happening. What we see a lot in Omaha are girls disappearing or boys disappearing. And we have to remember, it's not just girls that are victimized, it's boys too. But we see them disappear, and the mentality is, well, they're just a runaway. And as if somehow a child who is a runaway is less important than a child who has been just, removed from their front yard. There is no difference. But what's happening to these children that disappear, that we're calling runaways, is that often they are in trafficking situations. But there's a term that is used, and it drives me crazy, by some people in the counter trafficking industry and the legal industry. They call them throwaways. So runaways or people who are displaced from their families are called throwaways. And again, that is more of that dehumanizing of a human being.
Mm-hmm. Now, in the time we have remaining, before you tell me all how people can get in touch with you, how they can go to your website, how can a parent identify signs that something maybe inappropriate is taking place with their son or daughter online, and what can they do to really counter this so that their child does not wind up, as a quote unquote runaway?
That is a great question. I always tell parents that they need to know where their kids are at all times in the real world and in cyber world. And I'll have parents say, but the privacy issue, my children are 15, 12, and 10, and they can have all of the privacy that they need in the bathroom. Everywhere else, it's mine, because I know how dangerous it is out there, and I want to make sure they're protected. And so as parents, we need to be going through their social media. We need to know exactly what they're doing online. We need to know who they're friends with, who they're talking to. There's a study that says if your kids have more, and we're talking middle school, high school, have more than 200 followers, which to a kid is not a lot. That would just do them in. But 200 followers, their rate of victimization and cyberbullying increases significantly. So if we've got kids who have more than 200 followers, there's a huge likelihood that they have a predator following them. Why? Because kids don't really know 200 people. And so as parents, that's something we can do. But I think the biggest thing that parents need to do is keep very good open communication with their kids. If it's relationship building that is happening in the trafficking world, we need to build bigger and better relationships. I always tell parents, the traffickers have huge networks. We need to build bigger ones. And so having those open communication lines with our kids, knowing where they are, being available for our kids to come to us and say, okay, this is what's going on, and maybe not reacting on the outside until you hear the whole story, and then being somebody that our kids can come to and trust with information that is hard for us to hear sometimes. And so those are some of the things that we really try and instill in parents. And then little stuff like, hey, have a charging station where all media by, say, 10 o'clock goes in one spot so our kids aren't up in the middle of the night on social media. Be checking them randomly, have random media checks. Those are all things that we as parents need to do. That's really inconvenient and takes a lot of time, but our kids are worth it. And I would much rather have my kid be annoyed with me because I'm going through their social media than have them disappear one day.
Oh, absolutely. Now, how can people reach your organization?
Yes, well, they can go to setmefreeproject.net. They can email us at info@setmefreeproject.net, or Stephanie, if they want to email me directly. And our phone number is 1-800-716-9853. And we love to we'll travel anywhere to talk to kids. We go into schools. We'll talk to kids wherever they are about how to stay safe from human trafficking and social media safety. And we love to talk to parents and community members on how to keep our kids safe and how to spot a trafficked victim if one happens to cross our path, and then what to do about it.
Oh, absolutely excellent. That is excellent organization, great goals, and I commend you for your efforts.
Thank you very much.
Okay, and I'm definitely gonna be having you back in the future.
I would love that.
Seriously.
I would love that.
Okay, well, this ends our first half of the show, and I hope people will check underneath. If this is on YouTube, check underneath, and I'll have links to Stephanie's organization and other information as well. Think more and analyze more, and please just kind of cut out the mainstream media, because ultimately they're not going to give you the information, okay? You need to search for it. And this election cycle, it just seems to be even more the case. It just seems like the press, regardless of who they support, is just giving its own little version and just hoping you'll pick it up without questioning. And I don't care where you stand. Question everything you see. Now, that doesn't mean you can't get information and use it, but, well, you're going to have to look at it like a consumer going through a car lot. And, a used car salesman, he says, this car's perfect, and then, and then maybe the other salesman's going, no, this one's perfect. And they're not. And you investigate that car. So should it be any different when it comes to investigating the messages that are going out into the media today. Now, here's something, though. One of the things that's really been bothering me is, I was in college in the 1980s, and oh my gosh, the whole nuclear-free zone. The city I was living in declared itself a nuclear-free zone. There was this real big fear. Little kids were scared that mommy and daddy were going to get vaporized when they went to work by a nuclear warhead. I mean, the thing is, in those days, it was pretty much the countries that had the potential of really, ending life as we know it was the Soviet Union and the United States. To a lesser degree, of course, France and England. But the thing is, you never really, if you really looked at the issues carefully, you never really had America and the Soviet Union, just, waving the sword and saying, we're going to get you. You better watch out, that sort of thing. And moving missiles towards each other's borders. I mean, wasn't that what caused the whole Cuban Missile Crisis thing? But now, and I mean that by, maybe secretly they were moving. Of course, these countries knew that they were violating treaties left and right. I remember someone telling me about when he was in the military, one of his duties was to safeguard the nuclear weapons America had in the Philippines. Well, the thing is, if I can believe him, the Philippines was supposed to not have nuclear weapons in it. Okay? So, yes, these kinds of things happen. But now, you still, in those days, you still didn't have the idea that you were going to get vaporized. Okay? But now we see rumors of war, to borrow from the Bible, and we see the United States and China to a certain degree, and certainly Russia, kind of, getting in the ready stage. And it's sort of that, if you remember back to the 80s, the whole nuclear clock, and everything like that, and it's getting close to the doomsday. I'd say that clock's kind of ticking away now. And the thing is, we had the dream that when the Soviet Union fell, that everyone could just start cooperating, and the war of ideology would be over. But instead, what you had was more of a battle over resources and hegemony or influence. Now, so the Russia was not in a position to really cause much, concern for the United States. Yes, 9,000 nuclear warheads, but a conventional military that was shambles, an economy that was shambles. But then things started picking up, especially in the last few years under Putin. And now there seems to be this kind of what some people call a Wolfowitz doctrine. If anyone's going to threaten American supremacy in the world, then you have to do something about them. And right now, I mean, you've got things with sanctions, you've got war talk, you've got, with Russia, you've got situations where Russia goes into Crimea, an area that's 95% ethnic Russian. It's where their military, base on the Black Sea was. And they decided that when the U.S. organized the coup in Ukraine, I don't think that's too harsh a term. Just look it up, how that so-called color revolution took place. Well, Russia was feeling vulnerable that they could lose that. So they immediately seized Crimea, which has been part of Russian territory for pretty much all of the last 500 years. Now, you've got people saying, well, we're going to go to war over this. There's talk that Ukraine has been sending insurgents into Russian territory. And, whether that's Crimea or other areas. I haven't been able to really ascertain that, although I have heard that they have gone into Crimea. I don't know if they've gone into other areas of Russia and caused problems. But we're on kind of a weird course right now. Now, related to this, but not specifically about nuclear weapons, Angela Merkel, the leader of Germany, came out with a statement that's reported in the UK Independent. And you can look up the title if you wish. I'm sure it'll still be on there whenever you listen to this. Germany warns its citizens to stockpile emergency food and water in case of terror attack. Goes on to say Germany will have to stock Germans will have to stock enough food. This is written really strange here. For 10 days and enough water for 5 days. A newspaper has reported. Now, the thing is, 10 days of food, 5 days of water. I suppose they figured that, why store a lot of water, because maybe your hot water tank or your toilet will have water in it that you can use in case water gets shut down. Something happens to the infrastructure. But that sounds like something big, doesn't it? After 9/11, you didn't suddenly hear, George Bush coming out and saying, well, we need to stockpile a couple weeks of food and water. Although I will say it might not be a bad idea. I mean, there's things that can happen to an infrastructure. We've talked about on this show before. You could have an epidemic like the Spanish flu was back in 1918. That could rupture our infrastructure and therefore cause massive shortages of food and supplies. You could have an economic collapse. I think America is akin to Mount St. Helens back in 1980-ish. Can't remember. It was, somewhere around. No, it was 79 when St. Helens went off. And the interesting thing is they kept saying, well, we're getting these readings. It seems to be more seismic activity. Things just seem to be, heating up for an explosion. There was people that stayed. They were like, yeah, well, sure, whatever. And they died. The thing is that I think the United States economy is sort of in that same state right now. I'm not going to go over all the details, but if you look at derivatives, if you look at the housing bubble that's taken place, if you look at how many people are out of work, if you really look at all those things, we are in way worse shape than we were back in 2007. And if you don't believe me, if you're thinking, America's in pretty good shape, well, let's compare it to the Depression. And then let's point out that during the Depression, we did not have food stamps, WIC. We did not have welfare, aid-dependent families type things. We didn't have it. So, that if you consider what it would be like if we didn't, what America would look like today if we didn't have those things. It just magically disappeared. Now you get a picture of what the true state of the U.S. economy is. You've got massive unemployment that's way higher than the official fairy tale statistics that the U.S. government puts out based on the Consumer Price Index, which is questionable itself in regards to inflation. We're told inflation's low, but you go to the store and you find that you're buying stuff for the same price, but you're noticing it's smaller. Anyway, I'm kind of getting off here, but other things. I mean, there's always of course war. If America entered into some sort of war, especially if it was a limited nuclear war. I'm not talking about New York City being turned into a gravel pit. Okay, not that sort of war, but if you did have a situation where NATO and I'd say NATO and the United States. Come on, NATO is the United States. If you had NATO and Russia get into it, and they invaded Russian territory, I am very certain that the Russians would respond, and they would not tolerate any of their territory being taken. And they would probably, in my opinion, use, if they found themselves overwhelmed in some way conventionally, they would at least use tactical nukes. Not the big, giant mushroom clouds in the Nevada desert type, but more the small, knocks out maybe several city blocks worth of territory, enough to stop an army real fast, or a column of tanks or whatever. And I think this could be what Merkel is asking people to put food away for, because I really don't see. Of course, this is speculation on my behalf. I really don't see any kind of other scenario for Germany in regards to at least a man-made situation, in which you would suddenly, all of a sudden now, it's like, oh my gosh, we need to have food and water stored away. Again, probably a good idea to have these provisions, because things can happen, but it's certainly nothing that governments have been promoting. But I've noticed, I'll have to get the data to be it, because I don't like to say things that I haven't gotten 100% confirmed. But there's other governments in the West that have been kind of encouraging people to maybe, put a little bit of food and water away. And again, a little bit worrisome. Are they thinking it could be a war? And even short of a war, could it be what maybe Germany be worried that Russia would cut off its energy supply to Germany if things got tough? Well, the thing is that we are in an era right now where a lot of things could go wrong. Probably some things will go wrong. So maybe you should be, taking a lesson. I'm not talking about these preppers that have like a giant bunker with lots and lots and lots of storage in it. But I am saying that it's probably prudent to have something, maybe like what Angela here is saying, maybe a couple of weeks of storage is a good idea. And, I know there's people out there, for instance, there is a certain element of Christianity that says, well, Jesus will protect us. Well, tell it to the Ukrainians when Stalin was wiping them out back in the early 1930s. I think there was probably a lot of devout Christians living in Ukraine at that time. You can think of a lot of cases, like in Syria today, a lot of devout Christians being killed by both, ISIS as well as U.S. financed forces in the region. And the thing is that the idea that there's going to be some sort of rapture, is that anywhere in the Bible? I mean, when it talks about tribulations, does it suddenly say, well, you guys don't have to worry about it? There's no provision in there. It says, if you're going by latter day, the idea that there's, well, that's right, end times prophecies is usually what it's called. But if you're going by that, I've never seen an escape clause. The word rapture, it was never, Martin Luther never discussed it. John Calvin, Jonathan Edwards, I'm not talking about the politician. None of them discussed this. Sir Isaac Newton, who did a lot of really esoteric investigations into biblical prophecy, I think he figured that his idea was that Jesus would return in 2060. never mentioned a rapture. So the thing is, what do you tell your kids? After things fall apart, they're hungry, food's starting to run out because you didn't hang, it's just what was in your closet. What do you tell them? You tell them, well, it's time just to, what? Who do you blame? My personal opinion is that a lot of kids will be like really angry at their parents. A lot of spouses will be angry at each other. Maybe a lot of people will be angry at the church. You know, you did have a case during the plague. The idea people had that the Catholic Church had really promoted was that at first that this was a punishment for sin. But then people started noticing that really righteous people, nice people, good people, generous people were dying just as fast as people that were like the riffraff of society. This caused, to a certain degree, it actually opened up the door for such things as the Enlightenment later on, because people kind of got like, oh, well, I can't believe everything now. And I think you would have a massive loss of faith if you've had people say, just trust in, God, which is a good idea. I mean, yes, you should trust God. But you know what? If you look at the story of Joseph in the Old Testament, where Joseph told the Pharaoh to store away 7 years of provisions when times were good, because 7 years of bad times were coming. Okay. Who told him this? Well, we have to understand that if we believe the Bible, then that means Joseph was being inspired of God to be able to interpret this dream. Nowhere does it say the Egyptians were just supposed to repent and just kind of think, okay, God will provide. He did provide by warning them. Okay, that's provision too. If you're in a state where you feel that things are good, then maybe you should invest. You see, I'm not one of those people that makes money off this. You should invest maybe a couple $1,000 and just do a food rotation thing. Buy the stuff that you normally would. Just take a large closet somewhere that, just really right now just has a bunch of whatever, used clothes or something in it, and store food away in there. And then as time, you use a sack of flour, you go get another sack of flour, but then replace the sack of flour that you bought that was in that closet. In that way, at least you have something that could kind of tide you over if things were just kind of crashed for maybe a couple weeks or a month or something. And we don't have a civil defense program in the United States anymore, really. I mean, it used to be they used to store in tunnels and things like that. They used to store food in case things would go wrong. And, they don't do that anymore. In fact, I know they threw a lot of that stuff away or gave it away back in the 1970s. So there's nothing there. I mean, yes, there are civil defense systems set up for the people that have power, to save them in case something goes wrong. You don't need to worry about the people in Congress. They'll be safe. The rest of you, though, what are you going to do? So ultimately, I think maybe, no matter how you feel about Miss Merkel, she may, and there's some people already calling her a fearmonger and stuff. She may have a really good point, and if she's wrong, it doesn't hurt anyone. Okay? If she's wrong, it doesn't hurt anyone. If you're going to use that food anyway, just have a little stored up, and then just rotate. Okay? 10 days. Try it. And I think you might find that it has a lot of good, advantageous benefits. And again, if it never does, maybe if it never had rain, Noah would have been, at least he got some time with building a big boat or something. But a lot of people laughed at Noah, and they didn't make it. So anyway, that's all time I have for the show right now. I encourage people to come back next week for another edition of Unlock the Door Radio here on UCY TV Productions.
This is Ozzy Skateboard, and you're